Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zupko. Today we're going to speak about an interesting topic. It sounds like a NATO or the Collective Security Organization, but it's not in the West, but in the East. So we're going to speak about the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which originates from the conclusion of the Collective Security Treaty, which was signed in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, on May 15, 1992, by the heads of Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Later, it was joined by Azerbaijan, Belarus, and Georgia. The treaty entered into force upon completion of the national ratification procedures on April 20, 1994. This treaty has an interesting article called Article 4. Article 4 says if one of the member states undergoes aggression, armed attack, menacing to safety, stability, territorial integrity, and sovereignty, it will be considered by the member states as aggression. So there's a similar clause as NATO has. But we see the war in Ukraine, and we see attacks on Russian territory. And some people, they start to ask questions, what's the role of that collective security treaty organization nowadays? For that reason, I'm joined by Dr. Thomas Ambrosio. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Dr. Thomas Ambrosio is a professor of political science and public policy at North Dakota State University. As a political science professor, Dr. Ambrosio has extensively explored the dynamics between ethnic groups and nation states. His research covers a range of topics, including irredentism, the status of nations in international law, the influence of ethnic interest groups on foreign policy, and the impact of political structures on nationalist expression. His work also delves into how Russia's self-perception influences its interaction with the US and Israel in a unipolar international system. Dr. Ambrosio also researched Russia-China relations, authoritarian running regimes, American views on the Russian threat, and all connecting things with Russia and Russian foreign policy. He is also well known for the very good publications in leading scientific journals and books that he wrote. Many people speak about NATO, many people speak about Russia, but this security organization is a little bit, it's not well known among people. And when we consider the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict, when we consider Chechnya, now Ukraine, people ask, what's the point of this collective treaty organization? So let's start with the first question, and maybe we can elaborate a little bit on the objectives of this treaty in 2024.
So you had these initial members who were part of this initial organization, but then when it created, a full organization was created, not all the members of the initial treaty signed up. So it really is much more limited. So like Azerbaijan, Georgia, these are not members anymore. So the idea behind this CSTO, at least in theory, was to be Russia's response to NATO. And now, of course, we fast forward to 2024, and the CSTO looks like it's pretty much a dead letter. They just had a summit they had one in November. They just had one in January, but ultimately, this is a dead letter. It doesn't really meet the needs of anyone at this point. So at the last summit, you had one of the members. Again, we have a relatively small group of countries here. Armenia didn't show up. Armenia refused to show up because they were protesting the fact that the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, did not intervene on its behalf in its conflict with Azerbaijan. Now, there's a lot of kind of complications with this, but the Armenia is looking elsewhere. And the Russian foreign ministry spokesperson or Kremlin spokesperson had a statement, something like, we still consider Armenia an ally and we hope they do too. And so if you have one of the core members, the founding members, potentially leaving or at least looking askance at this organization, and that's going to undermine its credibility. So in 2024, unless something drastically changes, it looks like this may have run its course as an institution, but it's going to be something that'll limp along for a while because it's easier to keep it and have it mean very little than to actually just discard it, because that would send a message, at least for the other non-Russian members, that would send a message to Russia that they may not want to send. So they'll kind of play along for a bit.
In what ways has Russia leveraged the CSTO to counterbalance NATO, like influence in Eurasia and influence in the Eastern Europe? Can we at least compare some similarities between NATO and this organization? Or is the base principle of functioning a completely different scale?
I think it actually does compare pretty well in three ways, at least in theory. The first way was to lock these countries. So again, this is Russia's project. The other members benefit from other things too, but we could talk about that. But this was Russia's plan to lock these countries towards Russia, towards Moscow, in a security way, in a security manner. Because part of the CSTO treaty is that these members cannot join in an alliance with any other country. So to make that exclusive. There was also a de facto agreement that was made that no other countries would be allowed to have bases on these territories without the agreement of everyone. So that's the first thing, locking them towards Moscow. The second was that it legitimized Russian military bases. Now, you had bilateral agreements between these countries that allowed for Russia to have their military bases, but this gave it this kind of multilateral veneer, that it's not Russia doing this, it's a CSTO doing this, or it's, and it's very similar to the United States having military bases in Europe, which is part of NATO. So it's kind of has that veneer, even though everyone knows it's American bases there. And then finally, the idea behind the CSTO was to ensure that these countries look to Russia, not just for security, but also for their military hardware, as well as training. So they become increasingly dependent upon Russia for that. So you're kind of, if you think about it, locking these countries to Russia and not allowing them to go anywhere else.
Can we talk a little bit, what is the relation between Russia and the member states within this organization? Because we know that it's not that coherent as people think in a theoretical way, because we see many clashes among the countries. We have like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and others. Kazakhstan is also not willing to fully support Russia, for instance, in the war in Ukraine. So there are different narratives, but what's the complex overview of that?
Right. So Russia's, we could talk about kind of almost pre-Ukraine, post-Ukraine invasion in February of 22, and how that shifted relationships. So it happened a couple, so we can kind of go through each of the countries. So one of the issues you mentioned is that you have conflict and actually shooting going on occasionally between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Both of these are members of the CSTO, and there was some hope from both sides that Russia would intervene to kind of stop it, and they didn't, because of course Russia's distracted. So the Tajik president made some comments last year about how essentially saying, without saying, that Russia is failing in its role as security guarantor. Essentially, we signed up to this treaty and it's not providing us with security. So both of those countries are now questioning their relationship. Of course, Armenia is the big one because Armenia, its co-ethnics in Nagorno-Karabakh were essentially removed from Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan won that conflict completely now, and there has been some shelling into Armenia proper. So that was where Armenia saying, we're now, this should trigger the collective security clause. And Russia's like, well, those were kind of errant. Those were minor. It's not enough. But the reality is twofold. One, Russia simply does not have the bandwidth to do anything about it. either militarily or even probably, in terms of actually policy prescriptions. But also Azerbaijan has been playing has played this right, where they are reaching out to Russia and saying we want a more positive relationship with Russia. So Russia does not want to spoil its budding relationship with Azerbaijan, which has been rocky over the last few decades. So now we're talking, again, another country that Russia's having problems with Armenia. And then we have then we have Kazakhstan. Ever since Russia annexed Crimea in 14 and then the war began in the Donbass, and especially after the large scale invasion, Kazakhstan has really started to look very askance at Russia. Has looked at Russia very nervously because there was some concern that Russia may attempt a Ukraine-style scenario in northern Kazakhstan, where there's still a sizable but a smaller Russian minority. So you saw this entire process by which Kazakhstan began to change its national security documents. And I actually have an article about this where I kind of look through all their documents pre and post. They started to really boost up their military to kind of lock things down in the north even more than they already had. And then after the full-scale invasion, 22, Kazakhstan got really, really nervous at that point. And you started seeing Kazakh policy being very much going back to its older policy of multi-vectorism, which is that we want positive relations with everyone, and we're not going to lock ourselves into any direction, to Russia, to China, to the West. But of course, according to the treaty, they're supposed to be locked to Russia. So Kazakhstan is playing this interesting game. Again, complicating that a bit, so there's layers and layers and layers of complication. In January of 2022, the CSTO intervened in Kazakhstan in order to, as in part of the context of the protests and the, some would argue, attempted overthrow of the Tokayev government. It's unclear what's going on behind the scenes, but certainly there were mass protests, and the CSTO, for the first time, actually intervened in order to help a country deal with internal conflict. Now, that they didn't actually do anything on the ground as much as free up Kazakh troops and police to do what, their actions, to kind of crack down on it. And there was a sense or expectation in the Kremlin that now Kazakhstan owes us. Well, that very quickly became a dead letter, in the sense that the Kazakhs were like, nope, we don't owe you anything. We're not going to support you in Ukraine. In fact, we're going to allow Russian citizens to flee across the border, men of military age to flee across the border into Kazakhstan, and in fact, make it easier for them to get temporary residency and to integrate into our economy, because it's a great reverse brain drain from Russia to Kazakhstan. And the rhetoric coming out of Kazakhstan has been increasingly not anti-Russian, because they realize they have to live with Russia. Russia's not going anywhere. It's always going to be there, but certainly distancing themselves. So there's our next country. So again, pulling back. And then finally, we have Belarus. Now, in 2014, Belarus also went through a similar process that Kazakhstan did, which was starting to pull back a bit from Russia, starting to make maybe some overtures towards the West, even changing their national security documents and increasing their military and kind of independence. But the reality is that in the 2020 protests against Lukashenko, as a result of the election, Belarus is now effectively part of Russia for all intents and purposes. It's still independent, but that's largely on paper. It's probably about as autonomous as Chechnya is. Chechnya has a lot of autonomy, obviously, within Russia, probably more so than any of the other regions, but Belarus probably is about the same. So to some extent, Belarus is they're just locked to Russia now because their leader is locked to the Kremlin for his survival.
Is this treaty any useful for Russian energy and economic policies?
The Russia also has a parallel Eurasian Economic Union. So Russia had the CSTO for the military, and then the Eurasian Economic Union, which was Russia's response to the EU. They have that kind of running parallel. But even that has come upon some rocky grounds, largely because of the countries of the Eurasian Economic Union, with the exception of Belarus, have respected the sanctions that the West has put on Russia. Now, there's been obviously a lot under the table that has gone on, and maybe turning somewhat of a blind eye to some of what's going on in terms of economic interchange. But like the Kazakhs are like, yeah, we're going to follow the sanctions. And in fact, we're going to invite Russian companies that want to flee the sanctions into Kazakhstan, because you can do business here because the West likes us. And so that's even undermined the Eurasian Economic Union.
The reason why I ask is because in the West, we see how NATO troops and forces are protecting the infrastructure, for instance, energy infrastructure. Or we see some projects, that are very significant for economies of NATO members. So I was thinking, if Russia is using or was using this CSTO in that way, that sort of like smart way how to also spread a little bit of influence as well.
Actually, just kind of the opposite has happened, not necessarily through the CSTO, but because Kazakhstan has not been on the same page with Russia, there have been a number of problems with Kazakh exports, energy exports, which kind of came up. And there was even some like licensing issue or some some permits that weren't filed right, that Moscow claimed. So it's actually been just the opposite, that Russia's influence has actually waned even economically in these countries, and Russia has not gone out to protect the economies of these other countries.
When we speak about national interests, including infrastructure, energy, and economic policies, we have to mention the reaction of the Russian national interest and this collective treaty. Because we have members like Kazakhstan and Armenia, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. So how is the Russian national interest or interests, reflect into this treaty? Because if you are a member, you are supporting the treaty. So by that, you must also support the national interest of all the members. So how does it work in practice?
Well, I mean, the primary existential interest for Russia is to ensure that no outside power gets a foothold into what it sees as its sphere of influence. So that's the first thing that it does, which in that sense, it has been successful. Of course, obviously the Baltic states, another story. Ukraine is unwritten, but or at least hasn't been finalized yet. But at least within the CSTO, it has been a success. But in terms of other Russian interests, Russia has an interest in ensuring that it's able to continue to influence these countries. And also there's expectation of reciprocity, that these countries would support Russian goals, which that has not happened. So there was a rumor that kind of floated up that the Russians had asked the CSTO, will you send troops into Ukraine? And that was flat out denied. Will you support us in international institutions like the United Nations when there's resolutions about us? And that has been mixed. Some countries like Belarus have just supported Russia no matter what. Kazakhstan and others have abstained from many votes. Or in some cases, I always find funny, they just forgot to show up that day. They didn't want to vote yes, no, abstain. We're not there. We're absent. like the ambassador has something else to do. But that also sends a message. There's not positive. So you don't see this positive outpouring support. Again, Belarus is a different case. So that is very interesting. So if Russia's secure, existential interest, making sure no one gets influence in its region. Second would be this war in Ukraine, kind of a secondary interest. The CSTO has not been a vehicle for that. Now, if he has something similar for the United States, of course, the United States invaded Iraq, say in 2003. Not all NATO countries were on board with that. And in fact, countries like France and Germany openly opposed it. And a lot of NATO countries refused to send troops. But that NATO had a much stronger foundation that could weather these crises. Whereas with the CSTO, it was already rocky, and it's gotten even rockier.
Does CSTO have any friends or supporters outside of the bloc? Because we see some sort of movements and geopolitical dynamics related to Iran, North Korea, and maybe there is a bit of silent support coming from China. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, certainly, Iran and North Korea have been great supporters of Russia and its war in Ukraine, not through the CSTO process. It's more just kind of bilateral. China has been kind of sitting on the fence a bit more, I think, than Russia expected. One thing that China has really resisted is any formal military alliances, or they'll say we have a positive relation with the CSTO, we support its goals. A lot of those types of issues have actually been filtered through another institution. So we have kind of this institution salad within the former Soviet Union, which is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is Central Asia, with the exception of Turkmenistan, Russia, and then China, and now Pakistan and India. Iran is going to be joining, or they may have joined by now, but a lot of those issues kind of filter through that, but that's even an even weaker organization. It's much more of a talking shop than anything that's supposed to have any real substance to it.
So do you think that CSTO will expand to new members, or do you think that it will sort of cease its existence?
The CSTO, it's not going to expand. I can't imagine who else would sign up to it. Turkmenistan has had a historic neutrality. They don't want to be members of any organization. I don't know who else. You're basically kind of running out of members at a certain point. Uzbekistan has also sought to be independent in terms of its foreign policy. And also Uzbekistan is starting to also increase its ties to the West. So I can't see any new members joining. Now, will members leave? That I think is probably, I'm a little less clear about how that would actually turn out. We could think of it two ways. One, you stay in the organization and it doesn't really mean anything, but it makes Russia feel good. It doesn't provoke Russia. So, but by leaving, you would provoke Russia. So it's kind of cost-benefit analysis. If there's really no cost to staying in and playing nice, even Armenia says, we're not leaving. We're just not going to show up to, a meeting, the summit. There's very little cost to that. Whereas provoking Russia and saying we are actually pulling out, that actually does potentially create a cost. So it's easier to kind of be in something that doesn't really have any effect than to actively pull out. So I don't think that's in the cards right now. Because there are, at least again, in theory, it could still be useful one day. Because, ultimately, Russia's still going to be there. Ultimately, we know that Putin will not last forever and this regime will not last forever. So keep it for now, move to the future, see what happens.
As you mentioned, in case of Kazakhstan, that was the first instance of using the CSTO intervention. I think naturally there is a question following this information. Are there any CSTO troops or forces?
There is a kind of collective response team or crisis response team. But so even in the case of the intervention in Kazakhstan, it was with the umbrella of the CSTO, but it was like Russia ran its own show. And all the other countries that intervened, and they really just sent troops more for kind of performative reasons rather than any substance. They actually were not out there quelling violence or quelling protests. They were just kind of there, kind of in the background. So, in that sense, there's nothing like, well, even NATO doesn't really have troops. It just has institutions that can coordinate, and that's the best you're going to get with the CSTO. So kind of coordination bodies, but that's almost entirely going to be filtered through Russia.
And when we speak about this organization, naturally, the next question would be, what are they doing? Because we have so many meetings, like almost every second month, there is the statement, there is a picture of people gathering, there is one round table, and Putin is sitting, or some representatives are sitting together, and it looks very official, like we are leading some international organization, and we have the whole teams behind. But when I was searching for information in Russian or English, I didn't find that much. So what are those people doing?
Well, the word performative, I think, is a word that would be appropriate here. Think of it as just simply getting together, talking, making it clear to each other that you're at least in theory committed to positive working relationships. Because again, to get rid of it would be saying you're making a message as well. So there's kind of symbolic, but yeah, in terms of substance, again, if we try to compare this to NATO, it's not even in the same scale. It's very much it pales in comparison to that. NATO has a deep institutional structure. I'd be curious, man. I don't know the details, but I can't imagine how large the CSTO staff is. The NATO has small, sub headquarters throughout the world that actually have staffs dedicated to those. I can't imagine CSTO has much. So like that, the Eurasian Economic Union, I mean, they don't have a very large staff. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization doesn't have a large staff. We're talking almost like a papered over, kind of a paper mache over kind of a balloon that doesn't really just has air in it, and it looks big, but there's really nothing there, because if you crushed it, it would just.
And also, NATO has so many programs. For instance, research programs for cybersecurity. We have so many policy papers published on the NATO official website. We know about those training centers of excellence. So we can see, we can research those documents, and we can write about it. But honestly, that CSTO, I haven't come across any document stating that we have some research center somewhere in Moscow or different member states. And to me, it sounds like, if you want to run something international and you want to fulfill some expectations of the member states, you really need some agenda. So is there no agenda of the CSTO, or how is it?
Not really. Yeah, but part of that is also to allow for the creation of independent institutions. You have to be willing to give up some power. Now, NATO is still at its core an American-centered alliance. The United States runs the show. But we have these institutions that serve American interests, and as well as the interests of others. And we've helped to build that up. The Russians are not interested in that. The member states are not interested in that. So again, it's nice to get together, I guess. It's sometimes pleasant. You stay at nice hotels, you have some good food, and you just make this symbolic gesture towards we're willing to cooperate, which itself is not completely empty. I mean, the idea of at least presenting the willingness to cooperate makes cooperation possible. And that while it could be cooperation on a variety of issues, but where kind of the rubber hits the road, as we would say, on all the key crises that have popped up with the CSTO and its members, the CSTO has been found wanting. And as a result, it's not going to develop that institutional structure. If Russia was committed to something like a NATO, that'd be a different story. But their interests are far more limited. The saying about NATO is that it was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Well, Russia's interest with the CSTO is simply keep these countries towards us and make sure they don't get out of our orbit. And that's pretty much it.
You remember the times when there were articles about, is there any agenda for NATO, or does NATO have any agenda? It was sort of like institutional crisis of NATO. And do you think that CSTO organization can also go through that step and find a new agenda for the future?
Well, absolutely. So the NATO had its crisis. Okay, when the Soviet collapsed, like, what do we do? I mean, some talked about just dissolving NATO, but NATO was able to find a new mission. And the initial mission was, we're going to ensure that the countries of Eastern Europe, in particular the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary, the initial wave, that they do not have to worry about their security. All they need to do is to focus on their economic and political development. Now, of course, for the United States, it was also about expanding American influence, but we'll just, talk about the institution itself. So it was able to find a new mission. And then eventually that mission has now morphed into expanding NATO even further, promoting democracy. And then, of course, with the rise of China, there's some thought about that. But also, of course, as tensions increase between Russia and the West, now keeping the Russians out is still part of, everything old is new again, has now become part of NATO's mission. And as well as keeping the Americans in. And that's another thing that NATO has the advantage that the European countries realize that without the United States, their security begins to spiral away from them. Even all the talk, like, say, for example, in France, that we need to have, a European foreign policy, European security policy, European army. Everyone knows that's not going to happen. There's this desire to lock the United States in. You don't see that same desire in the CSTO to lock Russia in, because Russia has been, was, and may always be an imperial power. And certainly these countries were underneath the Russian Empire, whereas those countries of NATO do not have that same relationship with the United States. The United States is far away. It's an outside arbiter. There's never, the United States is not going to have any land claims against them, or no real desire to dominate their domestic politics. Whereas that's not the case for CSOs. There's always going to be that distance baked into any relationship. And of course, Russia invading or annexing parts of Ukraine and having a full-scale war is not going to make anyone, certainly not going to make anyone less concerned about Russian desires in their countries.
And is there any CSTO diplomatic strategy or diplomacy in general? For instance, when you speak about NATO, you have NATO diplomacy. People, even not members of NATO, are taking NATO as an institution, and they are dealing with it. They have some sort of relationship with NATO or NATO members. And this creates a diplomatic movement, and many things are sorting out at that level. And my question to you is, was there a sort of a mistake that Russia made in terms of diplomacy, so that CSTO is not proceeding as Russia wanted?
I'm not sure how much of it was a bug in the system, but rather what it was intended to do. Again, NATO was meant to do something different, I think, than the CSTO. So yeah, there really is no. I think this, Secretary General, this CSTO probably meets with other, dignitaries, but there's never a sense that actually has any power to or any real influence. So you're not going to go to the CSTO for training, for example, even though they have joint exercise and they may invite some other observers and things of that nature. It's nothing like NATO's actually helping to train. And in fact, some members of the CSTO have also trained with NATO. That is permitted. They just can't join an alliance. whereas they're learning something from NATO. NATO has something to give them. I'm not sure the CSTO has anything to give anyone. So there really is no diplomacy per se, because if you're going to talk to the CSTO, you're talking again, pretty much to not almost no real institutional structure. You might as well just talk to Russia. And countries, of course, have been a little bit mixed about how they want to talk to Russia in the current environment.
One of the questions that I come across is the relationship between the BRICS countries and this CSTO. And some people were speculating that can the idea, not the CSTO itself, but the idea of CSTO be a sort of foundation for the future BRICS military treaty or organization?
Well, we'd even have to back up further and say, what is really the role of the BRICS? Other than, again, kind of a talking shop of this kind of non-Western view on the world, and of course, starting with the economy, but then having larger geopolitics. But even that's weak. India is playing, a core member of the BRICS, but India is playing its own game because it wants to be aligned, it has historical lines with Russia and still has positive relations with Russia, but it's worried about China, which is Russia's ally, and has been seeking better relationship with the United States. So the BRICS itself, I think there's a lot of talk about the BRICS, especially in the Western press, especially the American press, which we're like, oh, it's a new, Soviet Union, in terms of, an enemy that, it's alliance, but it's really not. Again, it's more of a talking shop. It's more of a maybe some small coordination, but there's even some talk about having a BRICS currency, a basket of currencies that could be used, but even that's gone nowhere. So certainly there's no, if the BRICS, which is designed initially to be a kind of economic forum, if they can't even get that right 100%, they're not going to be able to take the next step into anything like a military alliance, especially if they're talking about expanding the BRICS even to more countries. It's hard enough to get the initial members to agree to anything. Getting more members is going to be even more difficult.
I think there are also many clashes inside the BRICS countries as a bloc. Now we have Argentina, little bit, going out of that gravity, let's say in that way. And also, it's interesting that Russian president couldn't come to South Africa for the summit because the security was not guaranteed. So it
was actually more than that. South Africa was bound by treaty to arrest him if he showed up, because he has been indicted by the International Criminal Court.
That's correct. So basically, from that perspective, when I take BRICS, when I take CSTO, why are those concepts so over narrative in the West? Or why we have that sort of like big respect that something is forming, something has been formed, and it represents the threat to the West or to the interests of some Western countries. Why we have that sort of perception? Why we speak about it that much?
I think it's honestly a legacy of the Cold War. It comes back to this sense of like, oh, look at these countries forming. There's still lots to talk about the Russian Chinese alliance. Now they are much more aligned and there's much more cooperation. And I think as we've gone on, we've seen much more of a closer relationship between the two. But even that's not a block of anything. I'm sure that, every time I know that every time the CSTO, or I'm sorry, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meets, there's articles in the Western press about, oh, you have this block that runs Eurasia that has 2.5 billion people in it, as this kind of counterbalance to the West. And then those of us who know a little bit more about this are like, yeah, but they got together, they talked, maybe there's some coordination on some minor issues. They do coordinate on things like drug trafficking and things of that nature and some cross-border immigration. But the reality is that it doesn't have, I think we are in that mindset of alliances and these kind of structures that look like ours, like Warsaw Pact did for the NATO. But the reality is far different.
I also think that there is that special aspect of nuclear weapons. When CSTO is presented, it's always presented as a bloc or military treaty or organization with nuclear weapons. And people are suddenly like, oh, but we have to be careful, because there are nuclear weapons. But we see, that as we concluded today, that the CSTO is not as active, is not as capable as we might think. And I think this is a very good clarification about those blocks. And I think it's also sort of like a contribution to the knowledge, to research more that CSTO, especially how it is at the moment. Because as we stated, those official statements, that's the official narrative. But what's behind is very important.
Absolutely. We just can't be taken in by the surface level presentation, and actually have to dig deeper and ask ourselves, what is it actually doing? And even more importantly, what are the interests of its members? NATO has a problem with Turkey. It's that simple. We have a serious problem with Turkey, where Turkey, they're kind of an ally. I'm not even convinced at this point, but they still remain in the tent because they have more influence that way, and we actually have more influence over them. Though there isn't actually a clause to kick any country out of NATO. No one thought of it, but well, here we are. So we have obviously NATO has its own problems, but the interests of the countries of NATO are much more aligned to continuing the cooperation and having this block. You don't have that. So we always have to ask, what do countries want? And what are their goals? And do these institutions actually meet these goals? CSTO, not so much.
Was there anything positive or significant during the CSTO times? Because as I read at the beginning, the treaty was signed, at particular year, basically after the Soviet Union. So it's a pretty long period of time. And still, I'm thinking, were there any successes or sort of like positive outcomes of this CSTO organization?
I think there. So I've been talking obviously poorly about the CSTO, and probably won't be invited to any of their summits. But I think the initial treaty and even the CSTO itself has had some benefits, because if you have an institution, even if it's super weak, even if it doesn't really function that much, if you at least have the expectation of cooperation, or even a context in which you are kind of required to perform a willingness to cooperate, that cooperation, again, is not meaningless. That performance is not meaningless, because the opposite would actually be detrimental. If you say, well, now we don't have any institutional structures, then you're in kind of pure kind of international relations anarchy, not chaos per se, but you have nothing linking the countries. Whereas at least in this situation, there is the willingness to talk makes it more likely to be willing to talk in the future rather than have conflict. Jar jar is better than war, as Churchill said. And even if all you're doing is talking, at least it's less likely you're going to be shooting at each other. And while the countries of, with the exception of Russia's, potential goals throughout the former Soviet Union, the only conflict, actual state conflict we've seen within the CSTO is between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. The other countries don't really have those same issues. So still getting together, meeting, talking, pretending to cooperate, and going back, and that's better than the opposite.
Have you spotted or have you researched about any impact of the CSTO on the security doctrine of Russia?
I haven't done research on it, but I do know that doesn't really have much of a role. Russia's security doctrine is based upon Russian interests and really Russian fears of the West. Now, it's mentioned as a cornerstone of Russian security, but it doesn't really do, again, as it's not doing anything. Russia is going to be taking care of its own security, and it's not like any of the countries of the CSTO can help Russia. And in fact, Russia's relationship with Belarus, again, we have this kind of subordinate relationship between the hierarchical relationship between the two. That is mostly done through bilateral means rather than filtered through the CSTO. So, Russia's increasing troop deployments in Belarus, that's not done under the umbrella of the CSTO. That's done in a bilateral manner. So the CSTO doesn't really play any role in that. Now, had the rumor been true that actually Russia did want the CSTO to intervene in Ukraine, and somehow they got the member states to agree, which is almost impossible, that might have changed things. But the fact that Belarus hasn't even actively helped Russia, they've allowed for basing and for Russians to actually shell into and shoot missiles into Ukraine from Belarusian territory. Even Belarus hasn't gotten involved. And if Belarus won't get involved, the CSTO is not going to be able to do anything to secure Russia's second interest. First interest, is kind of existential interest in keeping itself secure, and then this one is its most important active interest.
At the beginning, I mentioned all the countries that signed into that treaty, and then of course we have Azerbaijan left 1999, Georgia at the same, and then we have Uzbekistan that left 1999. Can we assess and briefly describe why those countries left?
I think it's different for both. So there you have the set of Georgia and Azerbaijan, which in the 90s started wanted to shift much more towards the West, and against Russia. So that was much more of we don't want to be with you, and therefore, and says we want to be with this other group. And of course, Georgia has long sought NATO membership. Uzbekistan is a little bit different. Uzbekistan, even though they've kind of been in and out of different Russian-led institutions, Uzbekistan has wanted to have much more of an independent foreign policy and not have itself locked down to countries. So that's why. So they want much more foreign policy independence. And because they're rather far removed from Russia, and they do have, of course, border issues, say with Kyrgyzstan, because you have the Fergana Valley, but they're kind of far removed from things. They're able to sustain that. So that's kind of why. It's not as for Uzbekistan. It's not we don't want to be with Russia. It's more we don't want to be with anyone. We want to retain our autonomy. Whereas for Georgia and Azerbaijan, at least initially, it was we just don't want to be part of your sphere of influence.
Why the CSTO is functioning in this way? A bit of secrecy, a bit of formal meetings, but we don't have those pragmatic steps. And we know that Russia is a big country and they have capabilities to do it. Also Kazakhstan, also a big country as well. And I'm thinking, is there any, maybe theoretically when we speak about it, is there any theory behind why is the CSTO functioning in this way? And as we say and as we assess, it's almost like nothing going on, there is like nothing to speak about. And that's, a bit strange for me. Why is it like that?
Well, I think we have to look at the interests of the countries, and we've kind of already gone through a lot of that.
Yes.
Also, with the exception of Russia and Belarus seeing a threat from the West, none of the other countries are threatened by any outside power. So if we contrast this to NATO, you had the Soviets right there. Kazakhstan's not going to be invaded by China. Kazakhstan's not going to be invaded by the United States. The other countries are not either. Armenia was, except with the exception of Belarus, probably as closely aligned with Russia. And Armenia has found when push came to shove, Russia wasn't there. And either there as part of the CSTO or even in a bilateral way. When the Azeris went in and basically took over Nagorno-Karabakh, the Russian peacekeeper just kind of walked away. So if that's the case, if you can't even get your bilateral relationship right, but Armenia isn't threatened by anyone else. So it's not like Iran is going to invade them or something like that. The only, enemy they have is Azerbaijan, and Russia was found wanting. So without that outside power or outside threat, there's no real need to align themselves with the United States. Again, contrast this with NATO. Again, NATO is kind of the exception that proves the rule that about the nature of alliances, because NATO is probably the most successful alliance we've ever seen, and the most institutionally deep alliance we've ever seen. So it's kind of hard to talk about, NATO, contrasting. Everything's going to look weak vis-a-vis NATO. But certainly Russia's wanted to present it, the CSTO, as a NATO. So therefore, they've invited the comparison. And without that outside threat, why do we need Russia so much?
Do you have any insights about Armenian case? Why the CSTO, didn't react or didn't go there? Because I understand, there is a geopolitical interest between Russia and Azerbaijan. It all relates to oil, energy, and strategic interests in the region. But still, if I'm thinking about the CSTO, the peace mission, or maybe some sort of stabilization sort of procedure or mission, could be possible in case of Armenia. But despite that, we didn't see any action in Armenia. Right. We saw only talking about this. We saw how Lavrov, Vladimir Putin, they were like, yeah, we are working on the security arrangement and all those things. But when we were reading after, like 2 or 3 weeks after, I couldn't find any specific missions or interventions or even peace talks between, the CSTO as a bloc and Azerbaijan, for instance, which I think is quite significant to know.
Right, exactly. So the ultimately, again, this is a Russian shop, so therefore everything can be filtered through Moscow in terms of decision making for the institution. And Moscow's argument was Nagorno-Karabakh isn't part of the CSTO. It's not Armenia. We don't recognize them as part of Armenia. Armenia hasn't annexed this territory either. It's not even Armenia itself. And as the Russians actually said this, Armenia itself doesn't recognize them as part of Armenia. So therefore, when Azerbaijan attacks it, they're not attacking a CSTO member at all. When you had the initial ceasefire, well, not in the 90s, but like the 2020 ceasefire, where you had Russian peacekeeper troops went in, it was made very clear that this is a Russian operation, not a CSTO operation. So the Russians themselves are the ones who intervened and sent in the peacekeepers, which of course were eventually pushed aside. So it was kind of a technical argument. Now, again, there was some shelling and some cross-border stuff that happened between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And there's some fear that Azerbaijan may try to force its way through Armenia into the lockdown corridor, or kind of to take the territory that's technically an exclave, not the lockdown corridor, but the territory that's exclave. If that happens, maybe the story might be different, because then you have a full actual invasion of Armenia. But the Russians, again, are distracted. So their response was, well, this is unfortunate, but we're looking, we have other issues going on at the moment, and this is not enough to trigger the CSTO treaty.
I think we might agree that unless there is a significant impulse, the CSTO is not going to rapidly develop or change in institutional way. But let's answer the last questions for today's interview. What can Russia and the members of the CSTO learn from this organization in terms of the security architecture or the security doctrines that they apply?
I think if lessons that, well, if I was, advising Vladimir Putin, even back in the day or even now, I would say, if you actually want this to work, you need to give these countries a reason to want it themselves. You have to understand what their interests are. Given the history, given what just, is ongoing in Ukraine, the lessons to be learned from this is that we can't have the same expectations, that we're not going to create a new NATO because the interests are different. We always have to think about those. So I'm not sure what lessons can be learned other than this is if the goal was to create a Russian-led NATO, it is a failure. What could have been, what lessons can we learn from that? It wasn't in anyone's interest to create that. And if you wanted to create something like that, the interests have to be different. And it's unclear if that even could ever be the case. Because again, the relationship between these countries and Russia, going all the way back to the empire, that's a very different set of relationships than your counterpart in the West. Whereas the United States went in and they helped to save West Europe from falling to, against World War II, but also from falling to communism. And the United States does not have the interest and the history there. That's negative. You're always going to have that with the CSTO. That's never going to change.
Dr. Ambrosio, thank you very much for your insightful thoughts and remarks about this very specific topic. I know that maybe some of our viewers might say, but there is nothing to talk about. But I think we clarified many important details about the CSTO. And I think it's also a good topic for research in terms of how it functioned in the past and what we can all learn from the CSTO. And also, in some way, I think we also put a little bit of clarification to understanding of the CSTO in the West. That it's not like a military bloc as we have in our minds, like NATO or other alliances. But this one, as Dr. Ambrosio said, it's not based on a common interest. Like, what is the common interest of the CSTO, of all the members? It's all led by Russia. And unfortunately, that sort of like style of management has some implications. And I think those implications are visible during crisis. Like we have the war in Ukraine, we have the case of Armenia, how in practical life the CSTO functioned. So again, thank you very much for being on IO Thinker.
Thank you for having me.
See you next time.
Take care.